These particular instruments, I mean, they're called instruments, but they were sometimes more like a noise maker. They were made to make a specific noise. And when I was out at the NMAI in their collections there, a few were apart, and they actually had an X-ray machine that they X-rayed some things so we could see what the inner workings were. They had a lot of different noise-making devices, and some of them had up inside of here, when you blow into it, there's kind of a pressurized chamber, and they would use tree sap and even sometimes little pieces of fabric to block the air from going around the reed. And the pressure would cause the reed to flutter, and then that would make a squawking noise of some kind. A lot of these ones were split. The red cedar was split, and so it would go back together almost perfectly when it split. And then the wood carving would be done on the inside. And if it did have a separate reed in there somehow, then a little reed would be made, and it would be a little chamber would be carved around for it and be placed in there. And then you needed to make sure that it was airtight around the reed so that air pressure could build up and make the reed flutter. And there was single beating reeds and double beating reeds. And some of them, simply the air going through them created the noise itself by being split by a little piece of wood. And the ones we're going to be making, that's the kind we're going to do, is that when you blow through it, the air hits a part of the wood and it splits it in half and goes two different directions, and that causes the noise. You can see, like up along here too, it looks like there's remnants of something like maybe, I don't know, I would say pitch or something that was, because if air leaked out, then you would try to seal it up, because you did need it, you needed all the air to be focusing on the inside. Oh yeah, and you can see on the end here that this one was clearly split instead of sawn, because the split took an interesting path, and it kind of came up and around here and went back down. And so splitting, you know, especially with a really nice grained piece of cedar like that, was the preferred method. I saw them now on a bandsaw because it's faster and easier.
So the pitch is on the midsection. Does it?
Yeah.
Is it that it's missing on the rest?
I'm
or
not
doesn't
sure.
Have to be on the rest
From what
for the sound.
From what I have discovered from making these is that this section here is where, on this type of thing, is where you would need the pressure. And so once that reed flutters and makes noise, I don't see why you would actually need to have this other part of it. Air could come out and leak out, and it wouldn't really matter. The most important part is usually this part here, where you need pressure build up to make the reed flutter, or whatever sort of noise-making instrument is in there. It needs some pretty good pressure, especially if you're blowing in here, and maybe the reed mechanism isn't placed, you know, but up in there. So. And I don't know if it's on both sides or not, but it looks like it was purposefully sealed to create a pressure chamber. Usually these sort of things were actually not used in sight. They were used for winter ceremonies, and during the ceremony, if somebody wanted to call out to bring a supernatural spirit, they would use something like this, and this could represent a spirit. It could represent somebody that's passed on. You know, that's difficult to say, but you know, it's a guess of what it is. But it certainly looks to me like it represents some kind of a spirit that's passed on. They were generally kept hidden and blown to make noise from a hidden location. And it was more about the sound producing a feeling, or of calling something out, or if there was something that was supposed to be supernatural happening during a ceremony. The noise of this would represent a supernatural happening. But I still think there's a lot of mystery behind these, because they haven't been really used for quite a while.
That one is 1876. Simpson, actually from Port Simpson. James Swan, who was one of the early Smithsonian collectors, purchased it there. And he had some information about it, the oral tradition about the frogs mocking Raven, and in anger, he caused the north wind to blow the frogs away and freeze them onto rocks. And he mentioned the association of frogs with the spring rain.
You know, globular rattles were generally associated with shamans, and so this is very much in the style of a globular rattle. And it's hard to tell when you read documentation if it's real documentation or if somebody just attached a story to it because of the frogs that are on there. I mean, there's lots of different stories that go along with frogs, but without having the actual artists right here telling you, you know, I think we're all sort of guessing. But I can tell you one thing: the relief carving on this, it always baffles me when I look at this quality of relief carving, because we have really, really sharp, highly polished tools today, and the tools that we actually use today are actually a better quality tool, but we still struggle to get that kind of quality in our work. Oh, I mean, I'm almost welling up with tears just looking at this because of the level of craftsmanship and thoughtfulness that went into making it. It's spectacular. It's form line design, and Tlingit, Haida, and Tsimshian we all fall under something that's being called form line, and that's a term that Bill Holm kind of coined. But you see the thick and thin lines are kind of ebbing and flowing with thickness, and they flow all the way through, and you'll see an ovoid and an S shape, and the black is the primary form line, and it all flows and connects together. And all of our designs are put together using this form line method. And it really is unique sort of to the northern Northwest coast. And it's amazing that with such few shapes being used, that somebody can fill up almost any given space with such proportion and attention to how it looks. This person tried to put his best into every shape. When you put your best effort into every shape you do, as a whole, you come up with a spectacular piece. I've heard my aunt talk about collecting little stones from the beach, and I've heard also that sometimes other objects would be put in there to give it a different sound. I've heard of people putting little pieces of metal. I've heard of little stones and bigger stones mixed. A bigger stone gives kind of a duller thud noise, where little small pebbles kind of give it, I don't know, more of like one of those rain stick sort of sounds. I've made several globular rattles, and I think, I'm not, and this is something I'm guessing, but when you take a globular rattle like this, and instead of shaking it like this to make it, you know, go ch-ch-ch-ch, if you take it and start rotating it around like this, and you get the noisemakers inside, it sort of gives you a harmonic humming sort of a noise, and it's a different sort of a thing, and you can almost kind of feel it resonating through your body when that's happening. It's just kind of a roll of the wrist, and the stones get rolling around, and then wood is a great transducer of sound, and so you almost kind of feel it like a tuning fork or something, you know, and it makes like a different sort of a noise. So, and I just, you know, did that in my studio when I'm rolling it around, but it's a different thing, and I kind of suspect that because these were so round, maybe they were rolled around like that to kind of make that harmonic sort of a noise. All up and down the Northwest coast, our legends and our stories, every little thing could have its own separate life. A person is a person, but your hand could be living its own separate life, and your hand could be depicted as its own little human or something that's living a life separate from its body. And there's a body, and I don't see a face attached to that body. if the story is correct, you said the frogs were frozen to a rock. Maybe this whole being represents the rock in its human form, and that's the other thing, is that rocks could be alive and have a human form.
So that intertwining of forms, is that a general principle of
Oh.
carving?
You find that all throughout the sculpture pieces and in the two-dimensional art, where one animal or creature or person, one of their body parts becomes another piece of another animal's body parts. That's why, and it's so difficult to tell what the meanings were, because there's so many different things going on, and you don't know if it was for a certain purpose or if it was just done for the sake of having the art look so spectacular and have all these meanings. But it's always, you'll see that so often where in the two-dimensional art too, where one object or they'll share a jaw. You look at it one direction and it looks like one animal and you clearly see the mouth, and then if you turn it the other direction you realize there's a creature down here sharing the mouth. The design part, I feel, is the most difficult part of this whole northern northwest coast. Is the carving is you have to be really good at it to make things look like this, but the design work that goes into it is by far the most time consuming to think about and make it all work and fit. And I think a lot of times, when you look at something like this, we don't see things of this magnitude a lot with our generation who's carving now, because we haven't worked with these shapes and forms as long. When you have thousands of years of somebody learning something and then passing it down, and then that person taking it a step further and passing it down, somebody who did something like this may have had 2,000 years of mastery put into them, and we had a break in the cycle, and artists kept having to come up with new, ingenious ways to decorate something like this. But when you keep working with that same shape and that same form over and over, imagine what it becomes, say, the 200th time somebody has done that. This is one of those ones where you see the joinery. It has a little notch in it. When you look at the very best pieces, they have that kind of a joinery. They made like a little lap notch, and that way when you set it on there, it stops it from shifting around. And this one has that one. You can see the notch. It comes around right here, then it goes up and over. And around here it comes up and it goes up and over. And so and the top piece has a notch too, so it fits in there, and that's going to prevent it from moving and shifting around. And a lot of times they weren't glued together, like we do now. They were sewn together knowing that they could get in and out of them if they needed to. They were so well used, I think they expected that sometimes they were going to have to get inside and repair things or replace the noisemakers that they'd put in there. You'll always see in these carvings that are made out of like an alder or maple, this is definitely something out of a hardwood, you'll notice that everything is carved to a uniform thickness. And the early carvers learned real fast, what sometimes we forget today, that the wood dries fast on the outside and it starts to shrink. And if the wood is a little too thick, the wood beneath it isn't shrinking as fast, and that causes it to crack. And to get a big piece of wood that's seasoned, that's this big, it's going to have gone through lots of cracking processes. And so you might get into it and you'll find halfway through a carving that there's a big crack running through your wood, and then that's really almost a toss it out moment. I'm positive these were probably carved green, and the hollowing process, it comes out a lot nicer and easier. Once alder dries, or maple, it's really hard, and it's hard on your tools, and it's hard to carve, physically harder. And the detail work, a lot of times we find that if the wood starts drying out to say like a little beyond halfway dry, then the wood's a little harder, and then you start getting a lot more detail and precision than when you're carving the wood green. It won't take like these little fine lines and stuff as well. It'll be a little fuzzy and things like that. Once it starts drying out a little more, or all the way dry even, then you can go back and start putting your details in there.